Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the How to Make Any Game Mechanics series. If you're new to the series, in each episode we randomly choose a viewer's game mechanic suggestion, and then I just try and create it in real time. Because everything is done off the dome with no extensive planning, it may not be the greatest implementation, so forgive any developer sins that may or may not take place. As always, if you're following along with this project and run into any hiccups along the way, there is a link to the GitHub for this project which contains each and every episode, and that is in the description box below. So after spinning an upgraded wheel pane, today's suggestion comes from Dijalina, who commented, "Any sort of fight mechanic would be cool. I have a pirate with a sword as my first character." Well, who doesn't like hitting things? This is going to be a really fun episode, I can just tell. Oh yeah, as a reminder, if you didn't see your suggestion in today's episode, these episodes are actually backlogged just a little bit. So don't worry, I didn't forget about you, I just haven't seen your suggestion yet. So inside of Unity, I created an episode 10 folder and an episode 10 scene. I am now inside that blank scene. But before I did so, I kind of predicted that this was going to be just a little bit of a longer episode, so I went ahead and grabbed some sprites that I pre-made and just threw them in a folder so they're ready to go. As always, let's do the very first thing, which is create our player. Let's right click on our hierarchy, make a 2D sprite, and let's make a square. We can then give the square a box collider 2D, and then let's duplicate that square. And this is going to be our ground. So let's move it down and scale it, and now we have a nice ground. Let's go ahead and click on our square, and I'm just going to reset the transform, and we can rename it to player. Let's also go ahead and rename our ground to ground. So instead of square one, I'm just going to type in ground. And now we can click on our player and we can add a rigid body 2D. In the very first episode of this series, we created a player controller, so let's add that in. So just player controller, and this is just for left and right movement. So I just gave him a movement speed of 3, and we're going to use transform movement. So let me just hit play, and we can move around on the ground as you would expect. So I'm just going to exit out of play mode, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the ground and just put it on the ground layer. I'm probably not going to add in any jumping because I think we already have our hands full with our melee system. Speaking of our melee system, let's go ahead and let's import some sprites for this episode. So I'm going to navigate over to my other monitor, and I'm just going to drag and drop them into our project folder. And there you have it. We now have 3 sprites in our scene. Let's go ahead and change the import settings for those sprites. So I'm just going to click on each and every one of them, and I'm going to change the pixels per unit to 16. I also want to go ahead and make sure there's no compression, and I'm going to change the filter mode from bilinear to point no filter. Then I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. There's one more setting we need to change for our main character, and let's just click on them, and then we're going to want to change it from single to multiple, as this is a sprite sheet with multiple frames. I'm then going to hit apply and open up the sprite editor. Inside the sprite editor, each and every sprite I made is 32 by 32. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to the top left and hit slice. I'm going to go grid by cell size and just manually enter in 32 by 32. And now we can hit the slice button and apply, and then our character is nice and sliced. We can then exit out of the sprite editor. It is worth noting whatever sprites you are using are going to have completely different settings, but I know what these settings are as I made these sprites myself. So before we continue on our melee combat journey, it's probably a good idea to talk about what we're going to be doing. So in a traditional game, usually you have animations, and these animations usually have combat frames right inside of them. For our example, I actually didn't put any melee frames in our sprite sheet, as generally I like to do something like in our 2D leveling system with some sort of a interactive combat system. What this means is when I click, the sword swings and then it just stays in that position until you swing again, and that just makes it feel a little bit more interactive. We are not going to do it that way, as although I think it looks a little bit better, most of your projects are more than likely not compatible with that style of combat. Instead, we're going to go the animation route. So because we don't have those animation frames, we're basically just going to recreate them inside of Unity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the very first frame of my main character, and I'm just going to drag and drop it as a child of the player. And we can just hit save here, as I was just for the sprite editor. And now our main character is a child of our player, and this is going to act as the visual for the player. So instead of MC_0, I'm just going to name this to player visual. We can then go ahead and click on our player, and we can remove the sprite renderer from our square character. And I'm just going to do it by checking the enable checkbox. We can then go ahead and change our collider to better match our sprite, so something like this. And now when I hit play, our character should fall and everything should look as normal. So character falls, and then we can move left and right, and he doesn't face left or right just yet, but that's okay. So I'm going to uncheck play. And before we do all of that fun stuff, let's just focus on the player attacking. So I'm just going to move the character somewhat towards the ground, just so he doesn't fall every time. And then for our player, I'm going to right click and create an empty object. And let's call this empty object something like, I don't know, weapon. This weapon is just going to act as a bit of a pivot point for our sword sprite. So I'm just going to move it somewhat into place, something like that. And then I'm going to drag and drop our sword to be a child of our weapon. So now we can take our sword and just kind of move it into place so that the hilt of our sword is going to rotate with the pivot of our weapon. So something like that. We can also just move it down a little bit more. And then when we rotate our weapon, our sword actually looks like it's moving from the hilt. Hopefully that's not too complicated, but basically we just changed the pivot point of our sword. We could have actually manually done that in the sprite editor, but I just wanted to show it done this way instead. From here, we can go ahead and we can start making our animation. Let's click on our main player object and go to Window, Animation, Animation. So inside the animation window, let's create an animation in our new episode 10 folder, and we can make a brand new folder and we can call it animations. And inside that folder, I'm just going to call it player idle. And for our player idle, we're going to want something like 2 frames per second. And if you don't have this samples option, you can just hit these 3 little dots and click the show sample rate checkbox right here. Anyways, for our second frame of animation, we're going to hit the record button, and we're just going to drag the second frame for our character inside. So I'm just going to click on the player visual and just drag that second frame into the sprite renderer slot. And now we have a little bob up and down animation. I'm going to want this weapon to somewhat follow that, so I'm going to uncheck play for our animation. And on our second frame, I'm just going to move our weapon down a little bit. So now when I hit play, you can see the sword moves into position, but it doesn't quite look right. What I'm going to do is select both frames of our weapon position animation, and then go to the curves option, right click both tangents, and make them constant. And this will just make sure that it doesn't try to interpolate between the two positions and just snaps into place. So when I hit play, you can see it just snaps into place and better matches the pixel art style. So the player idle is done, we can uncheck record and we can create a new clip. And I'm just going to call it player walking. And we can go ahead and basically do the same thing for our player walking. Let's hit the record button, click on our player visual, and let's start filling in the frames of our animation. So I'm going to change the samples to, I don't know, let's go something like 12. And then we can go ahead and for our first frame of animation, we can click this little sprite here, and this little sprite here next, and then the last sprite. And then if I move this down a bit, you can see exactly what that looks like. As for the idle animation, we're going to make sure this weapon bobs up and down with our animation. So when we go to this frame, let's move our weapon down, and then up a little, and then up even more, and then that should be fine. So let's highlight our position frames, go to curves, right click, both tangents constant. And now when we hit play, that looks a lot better. Finally, it is now time to uncheck record and let's move on to our attacking animation. So player attacking, and then I'm just going to change the samples to something like, I don't know, let's go 12 again. And then we can hit record, and for the second frame of the animation, I'm just going to make the weapon rotate all the way down. So something like that. So when we hit play, he just quickly swings his sword just like so. So I'm now going to uncheck record, and we can go ahead and we can set these animations up in the animator. So let's click on our animator and let's get these animations set up. I'm just going to move the any state up and move the entry over, just making it look a little bit nicer. And then something like this should be fine. So we can go make a transition from player idle to player walking to player idle, and now we can add some parameters. I'm going to just hit the little plus button, and let's make a bool, and I'm just going to call it capital I is capital W walking. So for our player idle to player walking, let's click this little transition, and let's click the condition and just make sure walking is true. We can uncheck exit time and make sure there's 0 transition duration, and do the same thing for walking to idle. But instead of true for is walking, we're going to make sure it is false. We're then going to uncheck exit time and no transition. Now comes the tricky part, the attack animation. What we're going to want to do is create a new trigger, and I'm just going to call it capital I is capital A attacking. And then we're going to go and make a transition from any state to player attacking, and then from player attacking back to idle. So now for our any state to player attacking, we're going to want to make sure that we go to conditions and make sure the is attacking trigger is set. We can then make sure we have no transition duration. And this is a very important one. We're going to want to make sure that it cannot transition to self. This will just make sure that we hit any bugs along the way and that it follows this exact pattern. Let's then go from player attacking to player idle, and we're actually going to want to have exit time, and we're going to want our exit time to be at 100%. So as soon as the animation is 100% completed, go to the idle animation. All we have to do now is make sure there's no transition duration, and as you can see, that looks a lot better and should work as expected. While we're here, we might as well go into our animations and make sure that that attacking animation does not loop. So that'll make sure that it only plays once and then goes to the player idle. Let's just move our animator off to the side and let's hit play, and we can click these boxes and make sure everything's working as expected so far. So I'm going to hit play, and you can see he is playing his idle animation. Let's hit the walking checkbox. And he is now walking pretty quickly, and then we can click the is attacking trigger, and he attacks even after walking, and then we can uncheck walking, and then just click attack, and he attacks as you would expect. So everything is working as we want it to, and we can uncheck play. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to make sure we can check these checkboxes off via code. So when we move, we go to the walking animation, and when we attack, we play the attacking animation. So let's navigate back to this episode's folder, and I'm going to make a new script, and let's just call it, I don't know, player combat. And then we can open that up with VS Code. I am inside VS Code, and we are going to start adding in our variables. So the very first variable we're going to add in is our animator variable, as you would probably expect. So let's make a serialized field, and let's make a private animator, and let's just call it anim for now. And then we can go ahead and make some strings for our parameters. So I'm going to make a private const string, and let's call it walk underscore param, and it's going to be equal to capital I is capital W walking. And then let's make another private const string, and let's call it attack param. And that's going to be equal to capital I is capital A attacking. If you've been keeping up with the episodes, you might remember that these are named after the animator values. So if I go back into Unity, we just want to make sure that we're calling it exactly what we called our parameters. So capital I is capital W walking, capital I is capital A attacking, and those just match up in our script. So let's go back into our script, and as you can see, they match up perfectly. So what we're going to do now is play these animations via code. So let's go into update, and let's make a float x equal to input.getAxes, and we can make it equal to horizontal. And all this is doing is just getting our X input, which we're using for walking left and right. Ideally, you would probably be doing something like this inside the player controller, But because we've been building this project up via various components through all of these episodes, I just feel like it'd be a little bit better to keep this all separate and not touch our player controller. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to say anim.setBool, and we're just going to set that walk parameter bool, and we're just going to set it to x not equal 0. And all this is going to do is return a true or false. So it's going to be true if we're hitting any of the x inputs, and it's going to be false when we're not. We can then go ahead and do our attack trigger. So what I'm going to do is just going to say if, and we can just check input.getKeyDown, and we're going to do keycode.f. So when you hit the F key, we are going to anim.setTrigger, and we're going to be setting our attack parameter trigger. So basically, when you hit F, just play the attacking animation. And we're just going to leave it as is for now, and we're going to save up, and let's just head back into Unity to make sure these animations are correctly playing. So back in Unity, let's click on our player, and let's scroll down, add component, and let's just do player combat. And for anim, I didn't make it get it in start, so let's just drag our player's animator right in here. We can now hit play, and we have our player doing an idle animation, and when I walk left or right, he plays his walking animation, and if I hit F, he plays his attacking animation as expected. So the next thing we should do is we should probably make our player face the correct direction. So let's go ahead and exit out of play mode, and let's head back into VS Code. So back in VS Code, we're going to use our scale to flip our player visual. So let's go ahead and let's make a serialized field, and let's make a private transform, and let's call it player visual. So inside Unity, we're just going to drag and drop our player visual into the player visual slot. We can then go ahead and make a private vector3, and let's just call it player scale. And this will keep track of the original scale of our player visual. So inside of start, let's make our player scale equal to player visual dot transform dot local scale. So whatever scale our player is will be stored here. So when we're flipping around our player, we know exactly what the original scale was. The next thing we can do is come into update, and what we're going to be checking is we're going to be checking if, and what we're going to be checking is if x is greater than 0. So if it is greater than 0, we know we're walking to the right, and our player visual dot transform dot local scale is going to be equal to the player scale, as our player is already facing right. If we are facing left, however, so else if, and then we're going to say x is less than 0, our player visual dot transform dot local scale is going to be equal to a new vector3, and inside we're going to do negative player scale dot x, player scale dot y, and player scale dot z. And that should be it. Our player should now be flipping via scale. Let's save this up, and let's head back into Unity. So what we just wrote via code is our player visual is right here. We have yet to drag it into the slot. All we're going to be doing is changing this x scale from 1 to -1. And as you can see, our player flips accordingly. What we also need to do is make sure we drag our weapon to be a child of our player visual. So now when we go from 1 to -1, the weapon flips with it. All that's left is to click on our player, scroll down, and drag our player visual into the player visual slot. So now when we hit play, we can play our walking animation this way, and it also plays the same direction. And when we hit F, our attack animation plays on both directions. And although we are now playing our animations correctly, we still don't have any sort of hitboxes or any sort of damage or anything like that. So what we're going to want to do on our player visual, let's create an empty object, and let's call it Hitbox. So for our hitbox, I'm going to add a component, and I'm just going to make a box collider 2D, and I'm going to make it a trigger. We can then move the trigger into place, and I'm just going to scale it just a little bit, something like that. And now I'm going to disable our hitbox. What we can now do is hit Window, Animation, Animation, and for our player attacking animation, we can hit the record button, and we can go ahead and turn the hitbox on. We can then go to the end of the animation and turn our hitbox off. And that actually saved our hitbox being active and inactive for the whole entirety of the animation. Our hitbox is actually over just a little bit too far, so we can go ahead and just move that over, making sure that record is unchecked so we can move this wherever we want in the future. And now that we have a hitbox, we can exit out of the animation window and go ahead and give it a tag. For the tag, I am going to call it, I don't know, something like player hitbox. And now that we have a hitbox, let's go ahead and make something to attack. So I'm going to go ahead and drag our dummy into the scene. And I'm just going to move him over a little bit. And I'm going to give him a box collider 2D. I'm just going to make sure the size is a little bit more suitable. And I'm going to go ahead and make it a trigger, and this will just allow our player to walk back and forth in front of him. What we can do now is go ahead and hit Window, Animation, Animation, and we can make some animations for our dummy. I'm going to create an idle animation. So in our animations folder, it's going to say dummy idle, and the dummy idle is just going to be exactly how it is normally. We can then go ahead and create a new clip, and let's just call it dummy hit. And I'm going to make sure the samples is something like 12. And we can hit the record button and we can make a fancy hit animation for our dummy. So I'm going to go to the first frame and make the color red. And then we can go to the second frame and make it back to white. And then hit play. And it just flashes red. And then go ahead and do a little bit of scaling and rotating to just make it a little bit more interesting. So I'm just going to scale him, I don't know, something like that. And it just makes it a bit better. We can then copy the first frame and make it the last frame. So something like that looks a little bit better to me. I'm going to up these samples to something like, I don't know, let's go 24, which is twice as fast. And I'm just going to drag the last frame out one. And I'm going to rotate our dummy. I'm going to rotate to the left first and then to the right a little bit. And then we can just copy the first frame and make sure we paste it on the last. So now we have something like that, and that's a pretty good hit animation. I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm going to uncheck record, exit out of the animation timeline, and then we can open up the animator. For our animator, I'm just going to move things into place a little bit, so something like this is a little bit more appropriate, and then hit the plus icon and then make a trigger, and we can just call it capital I is, capital H hit. And we can make a transition from idle to the hit animation and from hit back to idle. We can then click on the first transition, and what we're going to want to do is make sure the trigger is set for is hit. We don't want exit time, and we want 0 transition duration. For the hit back to idle, we want exit time. We're going to want that exit time to be at 100%. We're going to want 0 transition duration. And that should be it. We can then go into our animations folder and make sure the dummy hit has no loop time. Let's move our animator off to the right and let's hit play and make sure everything is working as intended. So I'm going to check off our little is hit checkbox, and he plays his hit animation and everything looks correct. So I'm going to exit out of play mode and let's go back to our episode 10 folder. And I'm going to make a new C# script. And I'm going to call it, I don't know, something like dummy controller. And let's open that up in VS Code. Inside VS Code, let's make some variables. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just get access to our animator. So let's make a serialized field. Let's make a private animator, and let's call it anim. And then we can get references to our hit parameter and to the player's hitbox. So what we're going to do is make a private const string, and let's just call this hit underscore param, and it's going to be equal to is hit. And then let's go ahead and get a reference to our player hitbox. So private const string, and let's just say player underscore hitbox underscore tag, as that's what we're going to be getting access to. And we're going to do player hitbox, just like so. So you're just going to want to make sure that this is hit is named to whatever you called your parameter. and this player hitbox is named whatever you called your tag. We do not need start or update, so let's get rid of those. And we're going to make a on trigger enter. So on trigger enter 2D. And what we're going to do is we're just going to check the tag and then play the animation. So if other.gameObject.tag is equal to player hitbox tag, then we're just going to go anim.setTrigger, and in the brackets, we're just going to put in our hit param. And that should be it. Everything should now be set up for our dummy to play his hit animation when hit with our sword. So let's head back into Unity. So I am back in Unity, and let's click on our dummy, and let's scroll down, and let's make sure we add our dummy controller. So dummy controller, and then we can just drag the dummy into the anim slot. And then I just want to check one more thing. Let's click on our hitbox, and yep, I forgot to assign the tag. I created it, but I forgot to assign it when I was done. So let's just make sure it is tagged player hitbox. We can then go ahead and we can hit play. So I hit play, I can walk around, I can do my attack animation, and when I get close to the dummy and hit my attack, the dummy gets hit. And this is exactly what we wanted. You can see a little bit of weird clipping here, and that's just because our dummy isn't on the right sorting layer. So I'm just going to quickly fix that now. We can just put it on, I don't know, let's go -1. And that looks way better, and everything is working as intended. Just make sure you change that ordering layer outside of runtime. So I'm just gonna move the animator over, and then we can get a better look at me hitting this dummy. And this blue background is pretty gross, so let's go to the camera, change the background type to solid color, and I'm just going to pick this gray color. And that's it. That is the end of episode 10 of our How to Make Any Game Mechanics series. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have any ideas for a future episode, make sure you leave it in the comments section below. We also have a Discord, so if you run into any problems or just want to talk to like-minded developers, make sure to head on over and check it out. But that's all the time we have for this video, so I will see you guys next time.